Thank you for the invitation to Taiwan Iron Rose Festival, and namely Kengyi Wai, and to the Goethe Institute in Taipei. Today I would like to talk about theater as a political arena, as a place to assemble, to come together. I'm recording this in early July 2021 in Germany, where the idea, the image of people assembling, of coming together physically is still a bit scary, or feels almost a bit obscene after 1.5 years of learning how to keep distance, physical distance, and how to better not meet at all or only meet online. So it's a strange time to talk about assembling, but I think it's actually also a perfect time to be reminded why we actually need to assemble, and what theater as an art form has to contribute to that. And hopefully you will watch this in a moment where you can put this into action again. There's a provocation by the German theater maker and writer Heiner Müller that he made many years ago, and which was not surprisingly trending during the first lockdown. He said, close down all theaters for 1 year and then we will see what we actually need them for. Now we had months and months of theaters being shut down all over the world, maybe opened shortly but then closed again. But at least in Germany, I would say, instead of taking this advice and fundamentally rethinking our own medium and its routines, there was constant activity. Streamings and discussions, online readings, lectures, Zoom performances. Theaters were closed almost worldwide, and there was more theater available every single day than anyone could possibly watch. The horror vacui was, I guess, too strong. It prevented almost any silence, almost any taking time to reevaluate our arts and our lives. As if we were afraid, the moment we would stop, everything would fall apart. But within this never-ending talking and doing, there was actually, I think, a hidden answer to Heiner Müller's questions. What do we need theater for? While the phantom pain was growing, it became more and more apparent that all the screening and zooming was not even close to the real thing. It was a permanent referring to something absent. We would watch a performance online, but it only works because we still had in our bodies the feeling of being there, how it is to be in a performance actually. It was a referring to something that used to be there and hopefully would be there again soon. It only existed in this relationship. Because more than any art form, theater is a medium of assembly, a place to come together, to invent, try out, discuss, to struggle, agree, and disagree. A medium of social presence, an agonistic arena in which society can negotiate their conflicts and foster radical imagination. Because what is actually left of theater if we strip everything away that isn't essential to theater? There's a work by the Dutch theater maker Lotte van den Berg. She has an ongoing project called Building Conversation, where she aims actually to reduce theater to its core. So if we take away everything that we might like, that we might value, we might like to see in theater, but which is not absolutely necessary, what is left? There can be theater without actors, there can be theater without text, there can be theater without stage, there can be theater without props, obviously. So for Lotte van den Berg, what stays is that theater, first and foremost, is a place of communication, of meeting each other. A sphere where conflicts can be shown and experienced. An agreement to communicate, and, this is important, of obeying often very different rules. There's a frame of rules to it. And building conversation is indeed just this, talking with each other. Inspired by communication techniques from all over the world, models and frames of dialogues are developed. There are no actors, no audience, there's just the invitation to participate in a conversation. Without words, for example, one that is inspired by Inuit assemblies. Another one is alternating between reflection, retreat, and dialogue following a method invented by Jesuits. Yet another one, conversation happens completely without a moderator, topic, or goal, a method developed by quantum physicist David Bohm, exploring the patterns of our collective thinking, and there are many others like this. So what makes this conversation theater is the framing as theater, which enables us to engage and keep an analytic distance at the same time. Sometimes it just needs very few but precise decisions, gestures, rules to mark the space of art and open up a wide field of experience. And what is interesting in this work is that you really feel the responsibility of being an audience member, something that can only happen if you really share the physical space and not, for example, can black yourself out in a Zoom conference. So the responsibility of a witness, but even more the responsibility of a co-creator. And this needs presence. So I remember being at a conversation without words, and it starts with that you have to agree with the others how long this conversation without words should be. And well, no talking, so you kind of might think this will become boring quite soon. So some people said, okay, let's keep it to 20 minutes. Others thought, no, it needs at least 3 hours so something can happen, we can develop something. And well, I think in the end we agreed on something like 1.5 hours. And during this whole process then you were part of it. You agreed to 1.5 hours. So if you would walk out, you would not obey your own agreement. So this creates really a co-responsibility for what is happening, which is different from most other shows. Lotte Vandenberg calls it watching as responsible witnesses. I would say that Lotte's approach here is one answer to a problem that Bertolt Brecht already had analyzed in his famous short Organon for Theater in 1949, where he says, "The theater as we know it shows the structure of society, represented on stage, as incapable of being influenced by society in the auditorium." And not only the play on stage, but the whole theatrical setup, not to speak of the hierarchies within the institution itself, merely reproduce the system they aim to criticize. Well, I would say it's obviously not by chance that theater as assembly has become an important genre parallel to the square movements and occupations in the last 10 years, beginning around 2011 in Tunisia, in Cairo, in Madrid, etc., and then came Occupy Wall Street and on till today. But I would say there's a crucial difference to the assemblies in theater, between the assemblies in theater and the assemblies in activist movements, because there generally the assembly is considered to be something quite authentic, a space of authentic negotiation, a space of trying to abolish established hierarchies, of not only trying out but living a different way of decision making. And theater assembly might very much sympathize with with these ideas, but its potential lies in having a different take. Theater has a complicated relationship with authenticity, and this complicated relationship is interesting, I think, when it comes to political theater. So theater is not only a social but always a self-reflexive practice, despite the fact that a lot of conventional theater tries to negate this. Theater for me is a paradoxical machine that allows us to observe ourselves from the outside while we are part of it. It does not create an artificial outside of pure criticality, but neither is able to lure its audience into mere immersive identification. So theater marks a sphere where things are real and not real at the same time, where situation and practices are symbolic and actual at once. And this double take is, I think, the main feature of it. It's actually something we have in the most conventional theater, where we know all the time that the guy playing Hamlet is in real life Harry Miller or whatever, and Hamlet at the same time. So we can take this double take, but I think in a political context, in the context of assemblies, this becomes quite a powerful tool, because we can reflect what we are doing, but we are doing it at the same time. So the social spheres the assemblies theater can create offer the possibility of being part and at the same time watching ourselves from the outside. Among the most demanding artistic projects thriving for participation and representation are some of the works by the Dutch artist Jonas Staal. The New World Summit opens up alternative political spaces in form of quasi-parliamentarian conventions, and he invites to these representatives of organizations that are excluded from the democratic discourse, most of the time by being categorized as terrorists. So it's freedom, liberation movements, etc. So these summits offer intense and touching moments where voices can be heard that are elsewhere silenced, and where a radical idea of democracy appears on the horizon. However, as you might think with these kind of representatives, there are also moments of a strong sense of unease, of disagreement, or even anger, since these organizations are obviously not chosen by a criteria of political correctness. Some might appear easier, at least for a Western liberal audience, to identify with. For example, the Kurdish women's movement, whereas other causes might seem unacceptable. For example, when it comes to nationalism, violence, patriarchy, and hierarchies in many struggles for independence. So the New World Summit welcomes very different organizations, and there's no advice given how to judge or to relate to them. The only clarity comes in the critique of Western democracy, which base their existence on undemocratic, secretive, and often, even by their own standards, illegal ways of excluding what doesn't fit in their own scheme. As Claire Bishop pointed out in her essay Antagonism and Relational Aesthetics, participation should create a sense of, quote, unease and discomfort rather than belonging, end of quote. Treating all involved as, quote, subjects of independent thought is the essential prerequisite for political action, end of quote. So I would say it's not by chance that Jonas Staal often chooses to hold these New World Summits in theaters, in spaces which make everything that happens within them real and not real at the same time. As I said, that simultaneously are concrete and abstract, and in which the difference between presence and representation is always at stake. Here things can be shown and said that don't find a form elsewhere, and where radical imagination is, at rare moments at least, still possible. So there's a different form of assembly brought forward by a project called Training for the Future, a series of gatherings that Jonas Stahl and me are creating since a couple of years. And Training for the Future is a utopian training camp where audiences become trainees in creating alternative futures, learning how to decolonize society, how to use extraterritorial waters for political action, create new forms of encryption, enact intergenerational climate justice, socialize artificial intelligence, and campaign transnationally. Futurologists, progressive hackers, post-national activists, transnationalists, theater makers, artists, and many others offer concrete exercises in alternatives to the present-day crisis within a training installation. So it seems a consensus today that what is ahead of us can only be imagined as a disaster, and Training for the Future instead aims to collectively reclaim the means of production for the future. In March 2021, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, we did another edition of this Training for the Future, and we invited 11 trainers, and this time completely decentralized. So at the time where most gatherings happened online, Training for the Future insisted on a purely analog edition. While training together, finding common ground, creating even safe spaces are important features of a theater's assembly, it is also an arena to represent or even actually act out conflict. For me, always it has been quite helpful to think of the possibilities of theater, of political theater mainly, with a concept by philosopher Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau, who have developed the concept of agonistic pluralism. So what they basically say is that a lot of leftist theorists and thinkers, from Marx to Habermas or Rawls, imagine that there would be a possible consensus, that if we get better, if we develop further as humanity, we could reach a consensus. With Marx, that would be communism, I guess. But Chantal Mouffe and Laclau, they point out that this is a nice idea and we all would love that, but it will not happen. So not only because because we are human beings and affects play a role, and we are not perfect, but also that because there might not just be one solution to things. So the idea of striving for consensus brings a problem in societies that say there's no alternative, we have to go in this direction together, because it doesn't produce actually an agreement, it just makes certain ideas not be voiced. So what Mouffe argues is, in a moment where we always aim for consensus, what we actually create is antagonism, which eventually means whatever, civil war or something. So a full confrontation in which no negotiation is possible anymore. And she argues, instead of this consensus that produces antagonism, we need an agonistic sphere. Democracy is an agonistic sphere in which we can act out different opinions as adversaries, not as enemies. So we don't need to reconcile, but we can act out these differences. And the term agonism obviously comes from agon, the competition of arguments in Greek tragedy. So there's a direct link, I would say, to theater also in there. Some of the works of the Swiss theater director Milo Rau, who often makes very well-made, realistic theater plays, but some of the works are actually quite almost textbook example for a theater of assembly, as Chantal Mouffe might see it. For example, the Moscow trials from 2013 presented a theater setup in which 3 traumatic legal cases against Russian artists and curators were brought up again in front of a judge, but this time in the realm of art. So the protagonists of actual trials, as well as people with close links to them, were confronted with each other in an artificial but simultaneously highly realistic situation. So there were curators, artists, and critics on one side, which were involved in these three cases. And on the other side, there was a conservative TV moderator, Orthodox activists, and priests, etc. So one of the cases, for example, was the trial against Pussy Riot that you probably all know. So for 3 days, the Sakharov Center in Moscow became an agonistic space in which radically different opinions were exchanged in a way that was not possible anymore outside, in front of an audience that was just as involved as in the piece as the performers. The independent jury in the end decided by the smallest possible margin that art was innocent. So basically, there was no real division between an audience and participants in this. And the conflict was very real, that was reenacted in this trial. And it was interesting to see, and when you watch the film, the documentation that was made out of this, when you watch it, you can see how important it was for the artists, the curators, the critics, but also for the Orthodox activists and so on, to win this trial, even so it was only in the field of theater. So it was really about also a symbolic way of arguing and finding out who is right, who is wrong. So there are many other great examples of theater as assembly that I could mention. I could go on for a long time, but just to give another couple of names. For example, the attempt to pre-enact a different kind of climate conference, which was done by the theater director Frédéric Aïtouati and the philosopher Bruno Latour in Paris, or the different frame of actually elected politicians in a parliament which just had a few different rules than the normal parliament, by public movement, Make Art Policy in Helsinki and Düsseldorf, or the trial against art by Croatian directors Teja Topajic and Petra Zanki, where curators were defending art as a different way of living, as an alternative way of thinking. Or there are political parties actually that are performances or real political parties on this thin line. Most famously probably Christoph Schlingensief's Chance 2000 in 1998, or the United Estonia party as performance by the Estonian theater NO99. Or there are quiz shows. Illumination by the Hungarian company Kretakör was one of the probably most lively and most agonistic theater experiences. But you can also see theaters as places of resistance where people gather to discuss real politics and mobilize against politics. The most famous example, probably the Odeon Theater in Paris in 1968, but you can also mention it up to today, or almost today, the Black Tent Theater, Public Square Theater in Seoul. As Chantal Mouffe suggests, public space is the battleground for the agonistic struggle between opposing hegemonic projects. On a small scale, theater can create such spheres of open exchange, even in societies where free speech is scarce, or in Western democracies where the space between consensus and antagonism is becoming increasingly narrow. Art, using a differentiation by art theorist Mi Wong Kwon, not only in, but as public space, might be one of the most important things theater can offer. So I think while we negotiate what public space can be in the virtual world, which is enabled by private corporations, censored, commercialized, etc., we should not forget the role of assembling physically. As Judith Butler put it beautifully, so with some Anglo-Saxon pathos, during the Occupy Wall Street in 2011, quote, "It matters that as bodies we arrive together in public. As bodies we suffer, we require food and shelter, and as bodies we require one another in dependency and desire. So this is the politics of the public body, the requirements of the body, its movement and its voice. We sit and stand and move as the popular will, the one that electoral politics has forgotten and abandoned. But here we are, time and again, persisting, imagining the phrase, we the people." Thank you.